Hello and welcome to Season 13, Episode 11 of the Ubuntu podcast. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of June, would you believe it? And in this show, we're going to be talking about the community news and the other non-community news. Joining me this week are Martin. Hi, Martin.
Hello again. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. And Alan couldn't be with us tonight, so stepping into the breach, as ever, is community hero, the mighty Joe Ressington. Hi, Joe.
Hello, best friend in the world.
Oh, you listen. How sweet.
So, Joe, it's been a while since we've had you on the show. What have you been up to recently?
Well, among other things, I've been starting some new podcasts, including one with Popey of this very parish.
Oh, he's been moonlighting again, has he?
He's been moonlighting, yes. It's called The New Show, and we take questions from the audience and answer them, and they're usually silly things. Well, it's usually a mixture of some Linux, some tech, and some just random life, the universe, and everything type questions. It's quite good fun.
Obviously, the new show is the continuation of another show that used to exist that may have been erroneous. How's that transition gone for you all? And have you captured most of your audience of the prior podcast?
I don't think we've captured quite all of it, but certainly some of it. It would be nice if we caught the rest of it, but I think those people will find us eventually.
Right. And it's kind of Linuxy, open sourcey in the context of the rest of the world and life, the universe and everything, right? It's not just another Linux podcast.
Well, yeah, given that it's Popey, who's very much a Linux person, and Daniel Foray of Elementary, who is very much a Linux person, and me, it's always going to come back to Linux somehow or other, or open source or tech or whatever.
And what other podcasts have you been working on?
I've also started 2.5 admins, 2.5 admins is how it's written. And we had the clever domain hack, 2.5admins.com. And that's with Alan Jude and Jim Salter, both of whom are the two admins. And I'm supposedly the half admin, but I always say, really, that was just to have it be a catchy title. It should be 2.1 admins at best, really.
I was going to say, in the nicest possible way, Joe, I feel like you've oversold your billing there a little bit.
Yeah, I think well, you know, in the description of the show, I say I can just about configure a Samba server. So, you know.
And this is a sysadmin-y podcast?
Yeah, it's basically me asking them dumb questions and then trying to teach me how to be an admin, and also taking questions from the audience and sometimes discussing tech news and stuff like that.
Right. And have you got any other podcasts that you're trying to bootstrap at the moment, or podcasts that you would like to bootstrap?
I've always got ideas, put it that way, but there's nothing on the immediate horizon. But sometimes an idea just strikes you. And, you know, 2.5 admins came together very quickly, so who knows? But right now, I'm going to just stick to these three, because those two, and my main show, Late Night Linux, of course, and I'm just going to do those for now and see where it goes.
Very good.
Cool. Martin, what have you been up to?
Well, I don't know if you remember, but last summer there was a hit AAA game for Linux that hit the scenes, debuted at Joe's FOSS Talk Live event in London. And that game is, of course, ANSI Alien Attack. And I have been contracted by my daughter to help port ANSI Alien Attack to Scratch.
Right.
And I have to say, after a rather grueling 20 hours of scratching over the weekend, we're probably about 80% of the way there. So I consider myself quite the competent Scratch developer now.
Wow.
But isn't the whole point of it that it was written in Bash, and that's why it's cool?
Well, yes. I mean, that was obviously the remit for absolutely dominating the win in our gaming Create a Game in Bash challenge last year.
I don't know. Mark's text-based game with roguelike elements was pretty good. I know all your memes, you know.
It was that game was called Mzorpig, by the way, Joe.
Oh, that's the one, yeah.
I suppose the thing is that my daughter's just started to sort of embrace Scratch. She's at that age where Scratch is a thing that's on the curriculum at school, and we're doing homeschooling right now, and I get to pick up the computing part of that, or at least my wife has been picking it up in conjunction with Code Club that are streaming from our local library.
Oh, cool.
But my daughter, having not shown any interest in Scratch or computers until very recently, now absolutely loves it. And every spare moment she wants to be doing Scratch. And over the last, 6 weeks or so, has literally created hundreds of Scratch projects. So she's got into remixing other people's stuff. So, in Scratch, you can log in, find an interesting project, and then tinker with it. And she's been doing that. And I wanted to sort of break that cycle a little bit and show her that she could create her own things. So given that she helped me make Anti-Alien Attack, I thought, let's reimagine that game in Scratch, because she already understood it and knew, what we were trying to do there. So that's what we've been working on. And actually, have to say, the Scratch version is very good. It's very playable right now.
Is it available as a snap?
Not yet, but I did discover earlier today that there is a project called Scratcherpreter, which is a Scratch interpreter that compile Scratch into binaries. So if I can get that, and that is a snap, but if I can compile this game into a snap, then finally maybe Anti-Alien Attack will be available as a snap.
Wow. Right, let's get on with the show. And now it's time for the community news. And first up in the community news, Mint has announced that it's going to break Chromium in apt. So this was a follow-on from some comments that the Mint project made about snaps a while back. Some criticisms they had about how it removes control. I think their criticisms were mainly about how it removes control from distro makers. I'm not sure that I agree with most of their points about removing control from the users, but what they've decided to do is make it so that apt won't be able to install snapd as a result of installing another package. And because in Ubuntu, which Linux Mint is based on, Chromium is installed as a snap, and upgrades from previous versions, which might have been installed as a deb, by installing a snap with the apt package, it now means that Chromium won't be able to be installed through apt.
So have Mint actually broken Chromium in apt? It doesn't sound like they've broken Chromium.
Well, according to their monthly news post, it says that they are deliberately breaking it so that if you try and install Chromium via apt, it will just tell you why it's broken. And that is because instead of installing snapd and pulling down the snap of it, they're blocking that by default. You will then be able to manually install snapd and then snap install Chromium if you want to, but they are kind of making a point here, kind of drawing a line in the sand saying, we don't agree with this, and so we're going to try and put up this barrier to educate people about it.
Okay. I was quite surprised when I read this today, because obviously we made these changes in Ubuntu like 7 or 8 months ago, and it was well documented why we were making this change and the fact that we were making this change. And I suppose it's a bit disheartening to see that, Linux Mint have responded in this way. Feels a little bit hostile to me, because I think this post goes on to say that they're going to essentially make anything that wants snapd as a dependency in apt to be forcibly denied the ability to install snapd. And the reason why I feel this is maybe a little bit unfair to Linux Mint users is if you look at the statistics for snap adoption, which are, you can see publicly if you go and look at snapcraft.io/core or /core18. Those are snaps that are installed on all or most systems that have a snap installed. You will see after Ubuntu, Linux Mint is the second most popular platform for having users installing snaps. And this is despite the fact that, Linux Mint, they can choose their own path, but they have chosen that, a different path forward, and they don't have a snap store by default, and they don't promote snaps by default. But nevertheless, Linux Mint users are choosing to install snaps, and they're now going to make their users jump through additional hoops. And there's a lot of valuable software in the Snap Store that you can't easily get unless you install it as a Snap. So I feel like this is not just hostile, but a little bit user hostile to their own users. And I feel it's a bit sad because, we've been able to work with Manjaro and other distros and, come up with a perfectly workable way forwards where Snaps can be a first-class citizen, in other distributions.
Well, it's a good job Linux Mint are in control of their repos and compile all their own binaries and therefore can make these decisions for themselves. Oh, hang on a minute. Aren't they piggybacking on Ubuntu?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is, if they actually want their users to have access to Chromium, it's worth pointing out that Chromium, the upstream project, they don't actually supply much in terms of packages. There's basically, if you want a particular version of Chromium, you can go hunting around basically a file listing to try and get the version that you want. But the point is that they want you to use Chrome. Chromium is there as a sort of a nicety to the open source community. So there's work that goes in to anyone who wants to package it for their distro, which is why there's a Snap of it rather than a deb, because it was a lot easier to maintain that for all of the versions of Ubuntu.
Indeed. And that was at the crux of why we made the decision we do. We have, only so many people on the desktop team. We have a lot of work to do, and maintaining large applications such as Firefox, Chromium, and LibreOffice, for example, that's like a significant chunk out of our team's time. Just constantly because those, particularly the browsers, their release cadence is very rapid. So, part of the decision for switching Chromium, which is not the default browser in Ubuntu, to being a Snap means that we literally halved our development effort, which meant we got time back from people that were working on that stuff to do other things. And, people say, oh, well, this is evidence of, Canonical moving towards a Snap-only world. But it really wasn't. It was choosing where Snaps make sense for the release cadence. It's a fast-moving application. It's lower maintenance to maintain the Snap. And because, the Snap automatically works backwards across distribution releases. Whereas the debs, it's not maintaining the deb, but it's maintaining the build system that builds the new versions of Chromium on, say, 1404. We have to make sure all of those build requirements work. And sometimes we have to build whole PPAs of, the build environment in order to actually build a version of a browser for an old release.
Joe, what's up next?
Well, Joey over at OMG Ubuntu has written a speculative piece about what's going to be in Ubuntu 2010, because the LTS is very much in the rearview mirror now. That's done and dusted.
We won't talk about that anymore.
Yeah, no point. But what's coming up? What's exciting in 2010? Well, it looks like GNOME 3.38 and all of the various improvements that come with that. Is that true, Martin? Is that what you're going to have?
Definitely GNOME 3.38 will feature in the 2010 release. What I personally found interesting about reading this post on OMG Ubuntu is we, as a team, not behind closed doors necessarily, but at like company events, plan out the next 6 months of activities. And then we but then we put this in our Trello board, which is public, and we advertise publicly. If you go to the Ubuntu Desktop IRC channel, you can find links to all of the places where this stuff is documented. And then, of course, I read Joe's post and I'm like, wow, this is really insightful. Where did he get this from? So yeah, the stuff that's in Joey's post is a reflection of the things that we've planned for. There are obviously things that we do have to keep private because it may be that there is an OEM or an ODM that's asked us to do some work and we can't share that publicly because it's under NDA. But certainly the things that Joey have mentioned in that article are all accurate, and it's stuff that we're certainly working towards.
Oh, cool. Martin, what's next?
So, a friend and colleague of mine, Didier Roche, has written a series of blog posts about ZFS in Ubuntu 2004 and sort of the path as to how we got there. Yeah,
there's quite a lot to take in on these. I mean, he goes through the whole sort of general principles of how it's laid out, and the commands that you use for managing various aspects of ZFS. It's all very deep and detailed.
Yeah, I mean, Didier has a history of writing good quality blog posts like this to either explain what's coming up or give like a retrospective on how we got somewhere and why the decisions that we've made were made. And this is all very interesting stuff around ZFS because, some people were curious why they could, but probably shouldn't be manipulating some of the zvols by hand. The way that the ZFS implementation is delivered is so that people who don't know about ZFS get all of the benefits of, restore points without having to know the nuts and bolts of how to manage all of that stuff. And this goes to explain, well, how do you do that, but also why it's the way it is. And there's 3 quite detailed blog posts in this series. So if you like to get into the nitty-gritty of operating systems and file systems, or you just want to understand, this new capability in Ubuntu, then all 3 of them are definitely worth a good read.
Cool. Next up, Microkits is now available on Windows and macOS. So this is Canonical's Kubernetes distribution. Is that the right way of putting it?
It's one of Canonical's Kubernetes distributions. There is, we have sort of, what you'd call a traditional Kubernetes. And Microkits started as a single node Kubernetes so that anyone could easily stand up a Kubernetes node on their workstation. But it's in of itself, it's kind of become a full-on Kubernetes as well.
But the whole point of this is that it's for developers on their own machine. It's not supposed to be deployed in the cloud.
Yeah, exactly. It's to create you an analog development environment so that you can develop locally in more or less the same environment that you're going to deploy to. And it obviously makes sense for us to provide that capability everywhere developers live. And here's the shock for you. Not every developer is running Ubuntu.
No, some of them run Fedora.
You can use Kubernetes there as well because it's a snap.
But not on Linux Mint.
This will use VirtualBox or Hyper-V on Windows to stand up a VM, which then runs Kubernetes inside the VM. And on macOS, is it running in a VM there as well, or does it just run on the OS?
So multipass is sort of the front end to the hypervisor. That's a tool that we've been developing for some years now, and is sort of starting to blossom and bear fruit.
And the point of that is it uses the native hypervisor on whatever platform you're running it on. So it's KVM on Linux, Hyper-V on Windows, and what's the one on macOS? I can never remember that.
Hive.
Hive, that's it, yeah.
It does, but in the case where you may want to do something with multipass that isn't supported by the native hypervisor, then you can substitute the native hypervisor for something else. And one of the something else is VirtualBox. So if the native hypervisor doesn't do what you need, then you can swap in a different one. But multipass is used in lots of places now, and this is just one of them. But it means that we can deliver Ubuntu and its development tools to desktops everywhere, because we do acknowledge that not everyone is using Ubuntu, but we do want everyone to use Ubuntu. So by making Ubuntu pervasively available, then, developers have that option to use this stuff.
Well, people won't need to use Windows anymore because Lenovo is certifying all of its workstations for use with Ubuntu. That is all of its ThinkStations and its ThinkPad P range.
I didn't know that there was a ThinkStation. We talk so much about ThinkPads. I wasn't aware that ThinkStations was a thing.
Yeah, it's just a pre-built desktop, essentially.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah, we recently heard that, Fedora is now available on a range of Lenovo devices. And I think a lot of people interpreted that as this is brand new information. Linux is now available in the guise of Fedora on Lenovo devices. And we have been working with Lenovo for years, but haven't done a particularly good job of advertising that fact. So part of this is, to make it clear that, Ubuntu is well available for Lenovo, but also more so, it's an expression from Lenovo to make it clear that Linux is important to their business and their devices segment, regardless of what your allegiance to Linux distributions may be. I think, to coin a phrase, perhaps this year is the year of the Linux desktop.
And I think that's enough community news for this week. And now it's time for the news. Martin, what's first up in the news this week?
Well, glorious success and victory all around as GNOME gets a big open source patent win. You might remember that a little while ago we reported on the fact that GNOME were being pursued by a, in air quotes, patent troll around a case to do with image processing. Was it in Shotwell or? In
Shotwell,
yeah. And GNOME came out at that time and said that they were going to fight this and defend their position. And they have successfully done so.
Well, at the time, what they said was that they were going to have the case thrown out and then they were going to countersue and have the patent invalidated because there was prior art and it shouldn't have been granted in the first place. What's actually happened is that Rothschild Patent Imaging, who were bringing the case against them, have settled with them and agreed to license all of their patents to any open source licensed software. What hasn't happened is that the patent has been invalidated.
Okay.
So that's a shame because the hope was that if they could actually sort of counterattack and show that it wasn't worth going after projects like this because it would actually cost them in the long run because they then lose their patents, which they could use against other people. Then it might stop this happening in the future. But, it stopped this company suing open source projects. It's not necessarily stopped them suing non-open source projects, and it's not necessarily stopped other companies suing open source projects.
So it's kind of a semi-win, I think.
Yeah. It's better than it could have been if they just rolled over and paid.
Yeah, or taken it all the way and lost millions of dollars in the process.
Yeah. Next up in the news, Electronic Arts have released the source code for Command & Conquer onto GitHub.
Hang on, what's Command & Conqueror?
So Command & Conquer is the granddaddy of real-time strategy games. Unfortunately, there are no roguelike elements.
Well, end of story.
This is just a straight up real-time strategy from the DOS Windows 95 days.
Right.
And this month, they are releasing the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection, which is basically a modern remake of the original games. But alongside this, for some reason, with very little fanfare or explanation, on the Electronic Arts GitHub account, a bunch of C++ source code has appeared for Command & Conquer and Red Alert, which was its sequel.
Interesting. So is this just the source code, or does it include the game assets?
It appears to just be the source code from what I can tell, which is interesting because there is also an open source re-implementation of Command & Conquer called OpenRA, which again is just the source code and you have to have the original assets to play the game. So I'm wondering if this might actually be of use to them in sort of continuing the development of that and making it just like the original, or if they've gone so far beyond that now that they wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
But it's a curiosity really, because I'm not, the fact that there's nothing in the README file, there's no real explanation as to why they've chosen to do this or what they're expecting out of it. It's just there with a GPL license on it.
I mean, I quite like this myself. So OpenRA is in the Snap Store. And as you say, it's just the engine for OpenRA. And when you install it, it prompts you to point at the original CD-ROM in order to get the game assets, in order to ingest those and make the thing work. But I feel like there are a whole bunch, from my childhood, all of the computers and arcade machines that existed at that time, those games have been archived and catalogued and are freely, in big quotes, available to anyone, for the preservation of, a little bit of culture and a slice of history. They are available. And I feel like, as things have progressed over the years, there's going to be cultural elements of sort of, the gaming community that will be lost unless organizations choose to do something like this, where they, open source old code in order to sort of facilitate digital preservation.
And Joe, what's last in the news this week?
There is now a Raspberry Pi 4 with 8 gigabytes of RAM.
Wow.
And this is $75. And there's also a beta at the moment of a 64-bit version of what they're now calling Raspberry Pi OS, formerly Raspbian, of course. So this is getting really serious now. If you want to run a server with a bunch of containers, you're going to have 8 gigabytes of RAM to play with.
Yeah, or if you want to run this as a desktop, you're not going to be running out of RAM once you start opening a couple of browser tabs anymore.
Yeah. So I was fortunate enough to get an engineering sample of this new Raspberry Pi about a week before we released Ubuntu 20.04. So it wasn't just me. There's a number of colleagues around Canonical that the Raspberry Pi Foundation furnished with these devices, so we could ensure ahead of time that we would have day one support for the new Raspberry Pi. And there were some sort of subtle changes that needed to be accommodated for in the kernel and U-boot and what have you to make it all work. But I have to say, the 4 gig model is great. I've got a couple of 4 gig Raspberry Pi 4s, but an 8 gig Raspberry Pi 4 is quite a formidable device for 75 quid. As you say, containers and virtual machines and, even things like Nextcloud, right? People talk about running Nextcloud on a Raspberry Pi. Certainly a Raspberry Pi 4 has got enough horsepower to run a home instance, but the RAM has always been, a little bit, trim to do that. And now that's a thing you can do. But also you could run SyncThing alongside it for photo backup, and you could run Git-T for self-hosted source code and AdGuard, and you could do all of this on a single Raspberry Pi now. It's quite astonishing.
And you could use ZFS as the file system with all that RAM.
Well, maybe that's a bit of a stretch.
Well, my NAS, my x86 NAS, which is a passively cooled Celeron, that only has 4 gigabytes of RAM, and it's only got a couple of very basic pools. But that runs ZFS fine. So I would have thought with 8 gigs on a Raspberry Pi, as long as you're not planning to hook up 16 disks or something, I think just a couple of, one mirrored pool or whatever, you should probably be all right. But the big question is, come on, Ubuntu Mate when?
So I don't know if you've seen, I'm now officially a live streamer. I'm a YouTuber, all those things. So I did, on the day of release, I did a live stream. So I cunningly started a project shortly after 2004 was announced called Desktopify, which is a program that takes Ubuntu server for the Raspberry Pi, and you run Desktopify on this thing, and you can turn it into a desktop OS. And it supports the various flavors. And that is how you can get Ubuntu Mate or Ubuntu or Ubuntu Joe. I know that's your penchant. And you can bring up, one of the flavors desktop on a Raspberry Pi, 2, 3 or 4, but obviously a 4 with 8 gigs of RAM. And I did a live stream, did that live, went through the whole process with proper Ubuntu desktop. Started from 0, went through the whole process.
Cool.
And maybe, it's just us, right? Don't tell anyone. Maybe one of the things Joey's article we spoke about earlier didn't have on it is maybe we're working on Ubuntu desktop for the Raspberry Pi.
And on that bombshell, that's the end of the news. And that's all for episode 11. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for joining us, Joe.
Well, thanks for having me.
Are you going to come back next week and join us again?
Oh, yeah, I'll definitely come back next week. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, if you'd like to join us again next week, we'll be discussing if Ubuntu should become a rolling release. If you'd like to hear from us before then, you can join our Telegram channel at ubuntupodcast.org/telegram. You can tweet us at Ubuntu Podcast. And if you'd like your show to sound as good as ours, you should check out Joe Ressington's website over at joeress.com, where you can give him money and get his services.